is apparently significant in this wonderful Christian country. You're supposed to decide whose bereavements and which deaths you feel sorry about based upon where the dead people were born, apparently. I missed that bit of the Bible, but we are where we are. And then, actually, we can't talk much about Hillsborough today because many of the people involved in Hillsborough are currently on trial, so it is very much sub judice, and we could end up in contempt of court. But what I think we can say about Hillsborough is that in the aftermath of the tragedy, the speed with which the blame was put upon the victims was quite breathtaking. And that wasn't racism, except in the sense that some Scousers have complained in the past that they do feel that they're victims of something akin to racism in this country. And I'll be honest with you, I've laughed in their faces at it. Boris Johnson got into trouble, didn't he, for speaking about almost a sort of culture of complaint. A sort of victimhood that he alleged was displayed by residents of that city, and which he was very critical of, very insulting about. But actually, it wasn't racism, not in any meaningful sense. The way in which the victims were treated with contempt and blamed in the aftermath of Hillsborough, from newspaper front pages, various contributions from the quotes "great and the good" end quotes, and that is almost reassuring to see that on that occasion the hatred wasn't racist. So maybe the reaction to the Grenfell tragedy was a little bit more subtle than mere race baiting, than mere bigotry and prejudice, because it was very similar to the reaction to Hillsborough, where we moved incredibly quickly to blaming the victims or holding the victims responsible for much of what had gone on, and painting them in really unpleasant lights, the looting and the notion of pockets being rifled and that kind of thing. It was remarkable that. I don't get that. And I don't think any inquiry under the sun will provide an answer to that question. I don't subscribe to particularly conspiratorial schools of thought, but I do sometimes wonder about shadowy men in grey suits. Just sometimes. I do sometimes wonder whether that word establishment, which has been so successfully co-opted by the Kremlin recently to encourage people in the West to vote to destabilise their own democracies, but when it's used correctly, the word establishment, you think, well, if the truth got out, the people would revolt. If the truth about this got out, there'd be riots on the streets. So we've got to keep the truth under control. You could, I think, construe that as an act of national service, couldn't you? If you were a grey man in a suit hopping through the corridors of Whitehall, a mandarin near the top of the chains of command, you see, we have to suppress the truth on this, because if it gets out, there'll be uproar. I don't think there would be on a grand scale, on a national scale, but the fear that there might be would be enough to make people do, perhaps, shadowy things. And again, I understand what contract law is, and I understand what has probably happened in this case, but when you read that the chief executive of the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, who resigned after being accused of ignoring the safety fears of residents, is still being paid his full salary right now, today, you perhaps understand what I mean by the word establishment, don't you? So it's 10:15. We'll cross live at about past. The fire brigade have, I should stress, made it clear that they do not use helicopters to conduct rescues from high-rise tower fires. So the idea that they would have told residents of Grenfell to go to the roof in expectation of a helicopter arriving seems to be something that will be refuted. Indeed, the son from that 23rd floor, the only family to survive from that floor, says he doesn't believe that is what happened. But as we wait the details of the inquiry, as we wait to find out what Sir Martin Moore-Bick says in his opening comments, I'm tempted to ask you two questions. The first is, what do you want from this? What do you want to know? I haven't begun to answer that question, but my answer would involve some proper evidence trail on complaints being made about problems that became acute and what reaction those complaints received from the people who were nominally in charge. Because they're also in charge of us, these people, or these types of people. So what questions do you want answered? What do you want to know? Whether you are in Land's End, John O'Groats, or still living in the shadow of that blackened carcass, which looms over the West London skyline, like like a tombstone, actually. What do you want to know? And if you think this question's inappropriate, then just drop me a polite text and don't answer it. How confident are you that people will get the answers they want? I don't think that's inappropriate, but I'm often wrong. So if you feel that today's not the day to ask that question, then by all means tell me. I think it is, but as I say, I'm as much in your hands as you're in mine for 3 hours every weekday morning. Take the comments live, and I'd like to take 2 or 3 calls before that if I can. And if you want to be among that number, then you will get through if you hit the numbers now. 2 very specific questions, though. What do you want to happen? What answers do you want? And obviously, the closer you are to the tragedy, in many ways, the more interesting your answer to that question will be. But I'm interested in everybody's answers to it. And secondly, how confident are you, looking at the history of inquiries and cover-ups in this country, and revelations, better late than never, how confident are you that the truth will out? 0345 6060 973. It's 10:16.
Leading Britain's conversation. LBC with James O'Brien.
20 minutes after 10, the Grenfell Fire public inquiry opens. It's at the Connaught Rooms on Great Queen Street, in the heart of Freemason country, actually. But that's a complete coincidence. It's just a part of London that I happen to know quite well and be rather fond of. What questions do you want answers? What do you want to know? What would you put at the very top of the list of Sir Martin Moore-Bick's to-do list? We'll find out what's on it imminently. And how confident are you that that the truth will out? Kieran is in Brentford. Kieran, what would you like to say?
I'm one of the solicitors working on this. In fact, the Flora and Fared are clients of my firm.
Okay. This is the mother and son that I was describing in my introduction. Yeah. How are they, Kieran, if you don't mind me asking?
They are beyond traumatised.
Okay.
They're holding it together.
Okay.
That's all I can say. Their dad's a hero, actually. What really hasn't come out is people moved into their flat as the fire started, and he was trying to help some ladies get down. That's why they got separated from their dad, Saba, and he clearly must have been in a terrible situation to say that the best option was to jump at some point from a different floor.
He could, if he hadn't been helping those other women, he probably would have got out with his wife and son.
He'd have been with his son, and and with his wife. So it's a terrible. They're traumatised beyond all belief.
I'm sure.
Because she'd actually just got out of hospital the previous day, so she had just got back into the flat, and obviously her son is amazing the way he brought her down the stairs. But there are lots of stories like that. We Act for 44, and I'll be honest with you, James.
Come on.
It will get worse.
Yeah.
When we started to hear the 999 calls being made from the flats, the inquests have started to release those, but they're not released to the public yet. And I think if they are released within the inquiry, the sort of the rebellion on the streets you talk about will be heard, because you can hear the kids screaming in the backgrounds of flats.
But there's no. I mean, I in terms of what people would be revolting against at the moment, we don't know, do we? I mean, the empathy that one would feel hearing those calls.
They were ignored, James.
Right,
they were ignored. They complained. There is enough evidence that will come out of complaints of safety in that building, and I'm sure.
But they're not going to be on the 999 calls. You don't mean that the 999 calls were ignored. You mean that the warnings that this was imminent and inevitable.
In one case, we got 6 999 calls. And at least 3 of the calls initially were saying stay put.
Yeah.
So the stay put policy will be crucial. And I know the 999 workers, the people taking the calls were doing their best. Some were incredibly empathetic on those calls. Some were really busy and trying to take other calls, but they were dealing with people who were in a flat,
yes, of course,
trapped by fire and smoke, and they rushed the calls.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not criticising them. They were trying to take other calls, but they did their best. But the best advice they were told towards the end was wrap yourself in a towel, put it in water, and try and run through the fire. And
so the advice changes.
10 and 11-year-old
no, child. God, mate, I can't even begin to imagine it. But the advice changes as the tragedy unfolds. You sound. I mean, I don't think we've spoken before, so I've got nothing to compare it to. But you sound almost traumatised yourself, just through legal representation.
The solicitors working on this case are traumatised. It's one of the worst things we've ever worked on. But we didn't live through it, James.
I know.
We weren't there. So how bad must it be for them? And anyone who says, oh, these foreigners, race, these immigrants, what's their race got to do? These are human beings. These were children who were burnt or suffered smoke poisoning, cyanide poisoning. These people are not human who say those things.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean this as a reassurance, because two wrongs don't make a right, but I have been reflecting overnight on how the reaction to the Hillsborough victims possibly means that the bilious callousness wasn't actually racist. It was directed similarly at people from Liverpool, but that's a conversation that we'll have years down the line in sociology seminars. What questions are top of your list then, Kieran? And I'd like to keep in touch with you, if I may, after this call.
Yeah. The key questions are, what happened exactly? Why was it allowed to happen? Why were the people ignored? And we must ensure the voices of the survivors and the voices of the victims from the grave, from the 999 calls, they're heard. I think this judge, no matter what you people say about him, when he gets into this inquiry and he realises how terrible this tragedy was, it will move him. And he will hopefully, the final thing that needs to be done, make a report that changes the law in this country so this can never happen again.
And that would be laws regarding health and safety regulations, really.
Correct. And the way people in social housing are treated. That's crucial. I mean, there were people from all socio-economic, racial backgrounds in that tower. There were people who were working on well-paid jobs. It wasn't a tower that was full of poor people, but for some reason, because it was predominantly a social housing block, they were treated with disregard, disrespect, and contempt. That will come out in this inquiry. I have no doubt about it.
So you're confident the inquiry will make significant inroads into the territory you want it to?
Yeah. And look, our public services have been chopped and cut to death. And I know this can sound like a political point, but if the fire brigade don't have the equipment and the laws about planning didn't give them the access to get their high-rise equipment to the base of the building, but they didn't have sufficient oxygen tanks to go to the top of the tower because they had 30 minutes breathing time. All these things have to change because it will happen again. And your children, my children, and anyone listening to this should never suffer what the children suffered in that tower or the adults suffered in that tower.
And like you, I can't quite conceive of how we've ended up in a place where a comment like that could be construed as being in any way controversial. Kieran, are you going to be at the inquiry, or does your representation...
My colleagues are there today. I have to hold the fort at the office.
So it's the office that's in Brentford, is it?
Yes, it is.
Well, give your number to Caroline. Let's go for a beer after work one day. I'm only down the road in Chiswick. I'd love to find out more.
Definitely, James. Love to.
Take care. All right.
Thanks a million.
Thank you. Find out more about the work you're doing, because I think we're allowed to say it seems slightly more important than the work the rest of us are doing today. 28 minutes after 10 is the time. I'll squeeze in a couple of minutes with Alison, if I may, because there are a lot of people waiting to speak, and we're going to cross live, of course, shortly to the inquiry. Alison, what made you ring in? What do you want to say?
Gosh, I don't know what you say after listening to that. Actually.
You could hear it in his voice, couldn't you? The poor fella, because that's a lawyer. Lawyers are supposed to be, untouched. They sail serenely through the waters that the rest of us are floundering in. But that fella is living it, isn't he?
Terrific, just terrific. But in a way, I mean, what I wanted to say was, I think whatever he comes out with, and obviously the details and the facts and hows and whys and all the rest of it, yes. But he has to provide something that gives us a lasting and authoritative commentary on the state of our morality as a nation,
yes.
because that's really what it's about, that we've allowed these people to be somehow judged less important.
I'll read you a text. I wouldn't normally read it, but just in case anybody thinks I'm exaggerating, or that Kieran is exaggerating when he describes his dismay at the reaction of some of our fellow humans. James, tell this bloke I don't feel sorry for any of the Muslim men that burned to death in this block. I'm only bothered about the other races that lost their lives in the fire. And just glancing down his history of texting in the programme. It's not a trial. Well, I mean, it's not of someone who is faking their position in order to cause shock or to be controversial. It's
I don't know what you can say, except I don't think we've heard people express such extreme views since the Second World War.
No.
I really don't. I mean, that's just unimaginably inhuman.
Just being told that the man who died, the Muslim man who died, that we were referring to specifically, died precisely because he was trying to save 4 other women sheltering inside his flat. He gave his life in the hope of saving theirs. But hey, we are where we are. What's at the top of your list of things you want to find out?
I guess, I mean, I suppose the big one is how did this happen, which is a huge question because it goes right across.
Could be a very simple answer. I mean,
why people weren't listened to,
yes,
why planning rules weren't enforced and fire regulations weren't enforced. So it's a huge question. But how? And the whole of how.
You're right. It's too big to stick on a postcard, isn't it? The notion that for me is the thing. The relationship between complaint and response seems to me to be at the heart of preventing it from happening again. But obviously, the more invested you are in that actual tragedy, the more likely it is that your questions will be simpler, which will be, why were we told this? Why did that happen? Why did the lights not come on? Why did the cladding go up like a Roman candle? All of these questions in need of answers, and that inquiry due to open in a matter of minutes or so.
Do sit down, please. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the opening session of the inquiry. If you're here to translate for someone else, please don't worry about talking in a low voice while I'm making my opening statement. This is the formal opening of the public inquiry into the fire at Grenfell Tower in June this year. On that dreadful occasion, exactly 3 months ago, at least 80 people died when the building was engulfed by flames in a tragedy unprecedented in modern times. It's fitting that we should remember with humility and compassion those who died in the fire, their families and friends, and all who grieve for them. I therefore invite you to stand and join me in observing a minute's silence as a mark of respect for those who died and for those whose lives have been changed forever by the loss of those whom they loved.
I was listening to the broadcast of the opening, and perception sets a precedent.
Yes.
I've been involved since day one, facilitating trauma support to the survivors of Grenfell Tower and also the wider community. As of last Thursday, we're still hearing about people from the walk who've had no basic support from the authorities.
Yes.
They're not even on the radar. So my concern is, and I think, to be fair to the judge, he did acknowledge it, is about re-traumatisation that's going to occur.
Are you? Forgive me. Do you have a professional interest in this field, or are you just acting out of the goodness of your heart, or possibly both?
I'm just a volunteer.
Okay.
I don't operate in the mental health space, but
okay.
I'm working with a team of psychologists and psychotherapists who are linking them to anyone who's affected by trauma.
So this could easily sort of resurrect demons, for want of a better word, in the minds of people close to the tower.
I've already had a phone call yesterday with a concern about people who were giving evidence to this inquiry.
Of course.
Being re-traumatised. So it's already live.
But that would be true in many cases, wouldn't it? In any, cases involving violence or death or profound injury.
It would, and the report by Rachel at the end just articulated one of the concerns, which is this issue of people like the judge are seen as symbols of the system and as of authority, and they really need to appear in a humanised way to anybody that they...
What does that mean? I half of me nods along with you, and the other half doesn't know what you mean. We don't mean he should have turned up in a baseball cap, do we? What do we mean?
No. But we mean that there needs to be a degree of empathy and compassion that is visible to the people who are listening. to the people that are experiencing, to the people that are feeling.
Is this a generational shift? This will sound odd, but I'm thinking of Prince Harry and Prince William and comparing them to their grandfather, Prince Philip. So Prince Harry and Prince William belong to a generation that very much chimes with what you've just said. Prince Philip, by contrast, very much belongs to a generation that doesn't show emotion, that may well feel empathy, but doesn't feel the need to shout it from the rooftops. And perhaps, for good or for ill, Sir Martin Moore-Bick is closer to the stiff upper lip tradition of British public life than he is to the better out than in school of thought.
You know what? I'm not going to prejudge anybody, and I'm open-minded. I'm not a conspiracy theorist,
Good
but
man.
I'm hearing on the ground from people who, last Thursday, a 12-year-old girl talking about how they escaped,
Yes.
how her friends didn't escape, how they were trying to send Snapchat messages to school kids, trying to get in touch and warn people.
Yeah.
3 months down the line, they're still reliving this horror, and we're hearing it day in, day out.
Yes.
We get these calls about suicide, etc., etc. So my concern is that there are people there to support those who are going to have to relive that horror, because it's unavoidable.
I understand.
The nature of the inquiry.
That's something that we should look into, of course. Yes, proper pastoral care, psychological care for people who are going to be asked to relive a nightmare which, if only it were possible, they would, one imagines, give everything they own to put behind them. Ahmed, thank you. Do keep in touch, please. I say that to everybody who's down there doing important work on the ground, but I really do mean it. It's 12:01.